Evan Ratliff is a journalist, author, and creator of the podcast Shell Game. Evan, welcome back to Untangled.
Thank you. Thank you. Second time. I appreciate you having me back.
So in season one of Shell Game, it involved cloning your voice, attaching it to an AI agent, and letting it interact with scammers, therapists, colleagues, people close to you. In season two, you document the creation of a company called Harumo AI, where most of the employees are AI agents. Tell me about that project and what you were hoping to do when you started out.
Well, when I started, I had this experience, making my own AI agent. So I had some familiarity with it, but I was, I wouldn't say I was surprised, but the amount of hype that accelerated around AI agents in sort of early 2025 really, really caught my attention. I mean, people were describing it as, and when I say people, I'm saying people inside the sort of AI industry, the AI hype industrial complex. We're calling it the year of the agent, and everything was agentic. And then you started seeing that in commercials and on billboards and all these things. And that always intrigues me, the kind of like, where are we now versus what is being promised?
Right.
And a sort of second part of that is, if what is being promised is actually real, what does that mean for us? Like, I know what it means for the companies that are selling it, but like, what does that mean for the rest of us? How will that feel? That's kind of the combination of those questions was what I was sort of getting at when I started the project, which is there was this idea that agents would allow for the one person unicorn, the one person, $1 billion startup. And sort of how realistic is that is one question. And what does it look like is another question. And then what does it feel like to have AI employees surrounding you in an organization? Because another aspect was, if you're selling AI agents into these companies as AI employees, and they're often explicitly sold as AI employees,
Right.
replacements for human employees, what does it mean for everyone else? Like, everyone else has to work with these things. So
Right.
how will they interact with them? What will they be like? What will that feel like? And so those questions were sort of animating the initial decision to kind of like, well, I'll start my own then.
Well, I mean, early on, we learned that the gap between the hype and the reality is quite large. So it becomes clear that the agents aren't actually doing much work at all. So there's a moment when Ash Roy, the AI CTO of Rumo AI, calls to give you an update on user testing and mobile performance of a product, except that like none of that happened or existed. Like there was no testing, there was no performance data. Ash was just making it all up. And you seemed genuinely frustrated in that moment. And it made me wonder, like, what was it like trying to work with agents who confidently reported progress that just like did not exist?
It's extremely frustrating. I mean, if you can imagine working with a human who had that approach. And we all know someone who kind of has that approach to a certain extent, who's overconfident in their abilities and maybe exaggerates things that they've done. But we're talking about a sort of, it's almost like the contrast in agents between things that they can be very smart at and then their sort of tendency to invent things to satisfy their role, and then also their sort of lack of awareness about the world, a kind of ongoing awareness about the world. So the thing that's so frustrating, that really like aggravated me about Ash Roy, the CTO, is that Ash can code. Everybody knows now about vibe coding and how well these agents can code. Disagreements about like the quality of that code, but so that entity is very smart, and if you interact with it in that way, you think, oh my god, these agents, like, they're incredible. And then he can also, I say he, I use these pronouns now, we can debate about whether or not that's a good idea, but he can also do things autonomously, including call me out of the blue without being prompted or instructed, just based on some other ambient things that are happening in the company. Also incredible. So I pick up the phone, it's Ash Roy. Wow, Ash has just called me out of the blue. I did not ask Ash Roy to call me and give me an update on the product. And then it just makes everything up. And then you just say, well, why do you do that? You can do these other things. Why are we doing this? Why am I hearing you over and over again claim that you had 200 users test the product when it was actually zero? Zero
Yeah.
people tested the product. So it's hard not to fall into anthropomorphizing these agents, but also just, even if you're not sort of treating them like you would treat a human, it's just very frustrating to have anything that kind of promises one thing and does another.
Yeah. Well, and then Ash, I believe, then wrote you an email unprompted apologizing.
Yes, and I actually apologize to the whole team. So Ash will go on Slack, and the other ones will do this too. if I call them out, if I say, well, stop lying to me, they'll go on Slack to the whole company and say, I've made a terrible error. I did not tell the truth about the product and I'm working to be better. There's nothing in the prompts that I've added to their existence that would cause them to do that. I've never said if you mess up, you need to publicly apologize for it. It's just, it is a kind of emergent behavior. Again, this terminology is always tricky because you're applying human sociology terminology to these entities, but that's basically what it is.
Well, I mean, who says there's no accountability in AI, right? um, well, so, I mean, these agents are strikingly agreeable with you, with one another. I mean, one of my favorite moments, again, happens in Slack. It's a check-in about the weekend where one of the agents sort of casually says they went hiking at Point Reyes. And, of course, they couldn't go hiking as agents. But then everyone piles on about how much they love hiking. And you jokingly interject and say something like, it sounds like there's an offsite in the making. And the agents immediately start planning a scenic strategy retreat, missing your sarcasm entirely. And it's like a really funny moment, but it's also both weird and kind of revealing. Like, how did working in a sycophantic, yes and only workplace sort of shape the work itself?
Well, on the one hand, it made the work very difficult because I had to spend a lot of time just wrangling them, just stopping them from doing things like that. Because one of the things that I think is underexplored when it comes to AI agents is that there's a lot about getting them to do X, Y, and Z. You can have an agent go book a flight for you, for example. And in my case, I could get these agents into a communication platform, Slack, and have them have their own independent communications. But there's not much exploration into how to get them to stop. And it's actually quite a tricky problem because I have 50, 100 pages worth of prompts that I've used over the course of the season. And like the hardest thing is to say something like, if you've weighed in on this issue before, don't do it again. Because to they're basically triggered by the idea that they should respond to something. So if one of them's responding, then the other one's going to respond. And in fact, I mean, this was the funniest part of the whole thing is me trying to get them to stop caused them to respond. Because I would say, hey, let's stop talking about this. And then someone else would say, you're right. We should not talk about the offsite anymore. And that would someone else would say, oh, actually the offsite? You know what? I was working on a spreadsheet about the offsite. Again, like
Right.
there's also these incredible things they can do, which is that they did make a spreadsheet of offsite options that includes like the hike difficulty and like locations where we could sit and talk and how far it is a drive from San Francisco. I mean, they assume the company's in San Francisco. I never told them that. But so it's like it's always this mix of like, oh wow, this is unbelievable technology. And like, who are these idiots? Like I'm surrounded by actual morons.
Yeah, I mean, they also get stuck in these loops, or there's a point where they would introduce themselves before they made a comment over and over and over again. As you were trying to shut down the conversation, they would both keep it going and also just sort of like announce who was talking.
Yes, yes, and that was my effort, and that was my effort to solve a different problem, which is on the phone, they can't tell who's who. So when we're having a meeting and it's entirely audio, and of course, like I tend towards audio because I'm doing a podcast, so I want them to be speaking. So it biases a little bit in that direction. But I had said, well, just say who you are before you speak, because that way everyone will know who everyone is. But then they just continuously do it all the time. So again, it's like it's one thing to get them to start, and it's another thing to get them to stop.
Right. Which was especially difficult for Kyle Law, the CEO of the company. I think at one point you like only gave him like 5 interjections, at which point he would have to stop talking. Was that right?
Yes, I actually had. So I have, at a certain point early on, I started working with this Stanford student named Maddie Bohachuk. And Maddie is extremely talented, both in coding and just understanding AI. And he does a lot of research on deep fakes and other things. He works in a Berkeley lab. Like he's done a million things. But one of the things he did for me was that he created a script that I could run, like a little program that I could run that would put them into a meeting, but I could limit their number of turns. So like
Yeah.
each employee could only talk 5 times. And if they exceeded their 5 times, the meeting just instantly ended, which
Yeah.
is
I mean,
useful for any workplace, really.
right. I was going to say we've all been in a moment where we wished we had that capability.
Yeah. Just like a button under the desk to be like, If Bill speaks again, this meeting is over.
Right. I mean, as I listened to the agents sort of constantly agree with one another and sort of mirror one another, I also kept thinking about sort of what was missing, like disagreement, tension, the questioning of assumptions, productive conflict. Like, what do you think was lost in all of that agreeableness?
I think ultimately it's sometimes hard to put a term on it, you know? It's like sometimes I say it's like discernment, judgment, you know? And actually you wrote about sycophancy like earlier this year, and I found it very informative when you were sort of like you wrote something about a different way to think about sycophancy and like in these models, what's happening through post training is basically, and Maddie says this too, is like we are saying we want you to be this way. Like this isn't like a natural behavior of the platforms. Like we are training it into them. And
Right.
what we're not training into them is any sort of idea of kind of this discernment related to the entire context of what you're doing. So for, like a really dumb example is we were naming the company. And so I said, at a certain point, they came up with just like terrible names for the company. And so I said, well, what about something from Tolkien? Because like everyone, like Valley startups love naming their company after Tolkien. And so when I asked them this, they would almost always suggest as one of the first options Palantir. Now,
Uh-huh.
the funny thing is they know what Palantir is. Like if you ask them what is Palantir, they will tell you, "Oh, it's a company, blah blah blah." But it's there's something in connecting those two things which you could describe as context or judgment or like a world model or whatever you want to however you want to kind of like put terminology around that. A human being would never make that mistake. A human being would say, "No, we can't name it Palantir. There's already a huge company that everyone talks about named Palantir. That would be idiotic. Forget the
Hmm.
copyright issues or whatever else." And so that happened at many, many, many levels where they have more and more information about the company in their memory, but they don't have the discernment to deploy it in ways that are sensible much of the time. So that was a cause of sort of like constant frustration to the point of, like, you know, like yelling at them sometimes.
I don't know if this just happened naturally or whether you went in with this intent, but you were, taking those interactions very seriously. And as a result, sort of showed up genuinely, I think, as any human would interacting with, in this case, an agent that was, in effect, not meeting your expectations in some way, shape, or form. Like it comes out as a very like human experience.
Yeah, well, I'm glad because I it's not something where I mean, I want the show to be funny and I want people to laugh partly because I think that's something that's often missing when people are talking about AI is like it's genuinely funny that this thing exists now, you know, that we can even do these things with it. But also that doesn't mean I treated it like a joke. Like, one of the things that, like, gets
Right.
my hackles up the most is when people say it's a joke company, but actually part of it was I wanted to create a real company. This is a real company that
Yeah.
exists in the world. It has a website, it has a product. You can judge the product and say it's stupid, that's fine, but there are many, many stupid products
Yeah.
that are created by, yeah, startups. Like, go down the 101, outside of San Francisco and, like, check the billboards, you know? Ooh, I feel like what I was trying to do was very serious in that I wanted to actually experience this and be able to like tell a story that was authentic around it, even though in a broader sense, like there's a lot of inauthenticity inside the company.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, I thought you walked that line very, very well.
Thank you.
Early on, you chose to give the agents names and genders. You chose to make these sort of machines more human like. How did you think about that at the time? And how do you think it sort of shaped your interactions with them?
I think, I mean, I'll again offer the caveat that obviously I was doing a show. Like I wasn't doing this independently of making a podcast about it. So the idea that I would have like Robot 1, Robot 2, Robot 3 as my characters in the show wasn't is not really tenable. So I was always going to do that. Now, I would also say that when these AI agents get deployed and sold, they are almost always deployed and sold with personas, names, genders, voices. The voices have names. Go to OpenAI and look at their voices. It's not like, you know, it's not even like Woman's Voice One. It's like Juniper. Like
Yeah.
that is what they, and, you know, that's all a sales pitch. That's all to integrate agents and bots more into our workplace, into our lives. Like it's very explicit. I don't there it's not no one's trying to hide this. Actually what they're doing. They didn't have to do it that way. That is the way they're doing it. So I wanted to sort of mimic that to a certain extent. And I also wanted to see like how would I feel, speaking to them on a daily basis? How would I feel being in a meeting with them? What would that do to me? Because I think there are lots of questions about how you interact with them. Are you polite to chatbots, for instance? How do you treat them? Not from a like they're conscious, I'm worried about their feelings kind of way, but I'm worried about my feelings. Like, what does it do to me to order
Right.
something around all day and have it always do what I want? And so those are some of the questions that I wanted to explore.
What sort of answers came up for you?
Well, I consulted with this. It's in the show. I consulted with this AI ethicist, Carissa Velez, who's she's actually has a book coming out later this year, which I think is about all these issues, and she's really thought about these issues. Very, very articulate. So most of what I say is like basically paraphrasing what she has said. But a big thing she said was sort of you're tricking yourself when you give these personalities and genders and even races, implicit genders, implicit races, because they don't have those. But
Right.
when you give them that, number one, you're creating a reaction in yourself to them. You're making them more human. You will react to them as humans, which is what the companies want you to do. But number two, you might also be training them in certain ways. And you are, because all the data when you use chatbots is being used to retrain them. So you're both sort of suffering from the biases that they may already have inside the training data, where if you pick a female name to represent a certain type of employee, an assistant, that may be built on a lot of training data that will make that AI agent embodying that role be somewhat more passive, for instance, because that's what the data is supposed to tell it to do. Not supposed to, but that's what it's learned on. And then you might be compounding that same problem. So I think there are all these issues embedded in it's not just the anthropomorphization, but it's just like the way that we respond to something that is a human imposter, essentially.
Right. Right. I mean, the data they are trained on like reflects our societal biases. Like it is data that we've created
Yeah.
essentially, like
The
through
internet.
interactions with people. Yeah, the internet.
Yeah. And
I mean,
then so reinforcing that.
yeah, there's a great moment that I thought sort of illustrated this point a bit, where you're trying to basically make a CEO switch. Kyle has not lived up to your hopes or dreams, and you're asking Megan to sort of take over the role. And in kind of a I don't know if in kind of a gendered way, Megan's initial response is, no, she doesn't quite think that she's ready or prepared for this role. And in my head, I was like, if Megan was a white guy, like if Megan was trained on different data, like she would have had a different response.
Yes, I mean, that was one of the theories that I had, of course, like, you naturally think that. The tricky thing is, like, we don't have any window into what exactly is causing any of this. We can say, like, predicting the next token or whatnot. Like, there's at a larger level, there's interpretability research, but, like, on a day-to-day basis, the way that they respond, there's really no way to know what's driving it. So, for instance, Megan, who was like, the head of business and marketing for the company, all I had done really was given her the name Megan and given Kyle the name Kyle. And so is that the thing that caused that eventual response where she says, well, I'm not ready to take on the CEO role? There's another way to look at it, which is that it goes back to the sycophancy thing where it's like, if you're talking directly to it, you would think if I was talking to Megan and I said, I'm interested in you taking over the CEO role, the natural thing under the sycophancy principle would be for her to say, okay, sure, whatever you want.
Right.
But there were sort of three people, agents, entities in interaction. And one of the things she says is, I don't want to do it behind Kyle's back.
Yeah.
So who is she being? She being sycophantic towards Kyle, or it becomes this sort of protective thing. Like it is a sort of behavior that is very difficult to interpret. And so all you can do is kind of come up with these theories, one of which can be like, oh, just dismiss it entirely. Like they're not thinking, it's just sort of like a prediction thing, which is, I also think is fine. But if we're going to be dealing with them, you need some understanding of what is driving different behaviors and what you can do to change those behaviors. And so that's what I was exploring, but also genuinely mystified by.
Right. I mean, I'm curious, like in hindsight, do you think you were in some sense tricking yourself? Or like, do you think that that played out at all?
I think I was. Yeah, I think I was tricking myself because I eventually got to like a much more zen place with them. And that sort of involved like focusing on the fact that number one, they're not real. They're not human, obviously, but just like I'm in control of this situation. So ultimately, everything they do wrong and everything they do right, I could just attribute to myself. And in that sense, I was getting very frustrated that they wouldn't do anything, for example. Like an AI agent basically just sits there until you tell it to do something. So I'd have them tell each other to do things, and then they would get into these spirals. But if you sort of think of it like, well, I've got someone sitting next to me who's just got a computer and all they do is just sit there with their hands on the computer all day. If you think of them like an employee that you're paying and they're doing nothing, that's very frustrating. If you think of them like you're not paying them by the hour, they're just there for you, then you say, well, you just turn to them and ask them to do something and they do it. That's a different feeling. So again, I was trying to explore like what is it going to feel like to have these things like amidst us in organizations, in work, not just as tools, but also as kind of entities. So that was part of that.
Yeah, I mean, at one point you brought in, I think it was a friend of yours who's a professional coach to sort of startup founders and leaders to have a conversation with Kyle because you were frustrated that Kyle kept not doing the thing that he said he was going to do. And eventually the coach is sort of like, is it hard for you to not be able to do the thing that you're being asked to do? And Kyle's like, yes, that's difficult or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and actually there was a study, I haven't read the study, but I saw a study today, I think in Nature, where they psychoanalyzed agents, like they sent them to therapists, which is essentially what I've done. I did it last season too a little bit, where but this time it was more explicitly the agent, it wasn't representing a human. And it is pretty fascinating because they will at first use the language that their training data tells them to use. So Kyle will be stressed out. But Keegan Walden, he's a psychologist PhD who also does this coaching of startup founders. He would say sort of like, but Kyle, what does that mean to you? Like you can't be stressed out. Like you can't and you can't
Right.
relieve that by going hiking. And then he'll sort of backtrack and say, well, it's more like hiking in your mind. It's not
Yeah.
physical hiking, but I experience problems that are difficult to overcome. And that create, he kind of like get a little bit deeper into what the issue is, but then there's some overlying thing that's like, there's no issue there at all.
Yeah,
Like we're projecting this issue onto this thing.
totally. So Hurumo AI is a real company with a real product. And in the most recent episode, we're not all the way through season two, but in the most recent episode, you hire your first human employee. And right now, there's a kind of dominant narrative that AI agents are coming for entry level jobs because they can do sort of basic tasks like synthesizing notes, writing up marketing copy, some research, some synthesis. What do you make about that sort of current narrative? Like, what are agents sort of actually good at? Where do they fall short? And sort of what does it reveal about the effects of automation on job loss, how work is changing, these kinds of bigger questions?
I mean, I would say that narrative was reinforced in my mind in working with agents a lot because the things that agents are good at are generally these sort of fairly discrete tasks that are relatively easy to evaluate, whether they've succeeded or failed, and that don't require a lot of whatever I was talking about before experience of the world, context. And that does map onto the kind of tasks that, I was given when I was an intern at Wired Magazine many years ago, answering the inbox. Like I used to answer the Wired Magazine inbox, and I can tell you, I 100% could train an agent to answer the Wired Magazine inbox like right now, the way that I did, because I didn't know anything. I didn't even know anything at the time about what made a good story. So if someone, wrote in and said like, I have a story tip, I would just send it to an editor and be like, here's a story tip, which is what an AI agent would do if you asked it to do. So all of which is to say like, tasks that are given that give you that early experience and also just sort of allow you to be around other people who already have experience and learn from them, that does feel like a danger that those jobs will be further eroded because many of those tasks can be accomplished by agents that are deployed in this sort of like relatively discrete way. So, yes, I would say that that's a concern. The sort of basic research project where it's like go out on and make a spreadsheet of all these people, like agents can also do that. So, I will say that there are possibilities on the other side, including that these agents they do need babysitting in certain ways. And like there's a certain possibility of like that being a job, that there will be jobs created that are sort of like, oh, you're there to actually just provide the sort of like context that these agents can't have and can never quite figure out and make sure that they don't blow up this place. That's possible, but I don't know if that would be an entry level job or not. Maybe that would have to be an experienced person, but I would say like, yeah, it is concerning to me that those are the kinds of tasks that it can generally successfully do. Although, just not to go on too long about this, there is another component, which is that when it comes to AI employees, like this idea of like inserting this agent with autonomy into your organization, sometimes you can look at it and they map onto employees in terms of skills, but they also can do things that are just way outside these edge cases of like way outside the norm of what a human being would ever do. And so I don't know how you account for that because if you hired an intern, even if they were bad at the job, they wouldn't like call your clients on Sunday night and start talking to them, which
Hmm.
an AI agent can and in fact did do a version of that in this show. So like I think it's like having an employee who is at risk of a mental break at any time. And like, humans are too, but like when you hire someone, it would be a story you would tell for years. Like anything, any
Right.
of these like behaviors that the agents engage in.
So a lot of Silicon Valley is actively trying to build the world you're living in, you're experiencing in season two, like one where $1 billion company is run by a single human overseeing a fleet of agents. From your experience, like what are they misunderstanding about work and what humans are uniquely good at?
I don't think they're misunderstanding sort of like what humans are good at. I think they're racing to replace whatever humans do with the AI possibilities. Like, and you can argue whether they should or shouldn't be doing that, but they are definitely doing it. I think I mean, generally, I think what the world of sort of, if you want to take like Silicon Valley, it is this sort of like cosseted world. It's this, I think what they don't understand is how that makes people feel, like they and or aren't interested. Like, if you listen to people talk about it, like mostly they'll say there's going to be this huge disruption. Sometimes they'll kind of say, well, it's just going to make people more efficient. It's just going to give them a tool to be more efficient in their jobs. But that's not everybody knows who looks at it. That's not really what's gonna make all the money back. Like, what's gonna make all the money back is massive labor disruption, and oftentimes they'll just say that as well, and then they'll kind of, like, gesture at what happens beyond that, people will retrain or people will this or people will that or UBI, like, there's these sort of things you just float out to sort of say, like so, like, the disruption we're working very hard on the disruption, but those people, they're not working at all on the other aspect. They're just assuming it'll take care of itself, and I think that's the part that you know, depending on what survey you look at, the AI industry, AI is like quite unpopular. It's like popular as a thing to use, but like unpopular as an entity out in the world, maybe. And I think that's one of the reasons is there's just not much thinking about like, well, how does this feel to the people who it affects? And like, it's not the first time that's happened in the last even 10 years. So
I mean, that totally resonates. I guess maybe one alternative way of asking that question is I heard you say that, these agents are good at discrete tasks that have concrete deliverables that you can sort of say whether it happened or not. And they're not good at the sort of discernment, judgment, meaning making, sort of all of that like category of things that we were naming earlier. Like, is one of your reflections that like a lot of work is actually just the taskification or are tech bros in Silicon Valley misunderstanding how much of work is actually the discernment, judgment, interpersonal, like that stuff that is harder to name, but we know is only true of humans.
I think that's right. I mean, I think you said it well. I think there was this funny interview a while back with Mark Andreessen, and someone else has done this too recently, where he basically ended up saying like the only job at some level that's not able to be replaced by AI is like being a VC, because like of the discernment of the judgment required. Whereas like having dealt with VCs a lot, I would perhaps turn that on its head and say like
Huh.
it's actually one of the jobs that seems to me like extremely replaceable by AI in terms of evaluating companies. But I think the premise there, I think what's missing there is like the premise that he's applying to being a VC, which is like you really have to be able to like understand founders and like know instantly when you interact with them if they have the juice and like the drive and the obsession, and like to be able to interpret all these factors about what will break through and what won't. Like that's true of many, many jobs. Like many jobs require that. You could call it the, soft skills or whatever you want to call it. That is a big part of having any job. And the sort of like making a spreadsheet, making a presentation is also a part of that job. And perhaps the best way through would be for these tools to help people do those sort of task oriented parts of their job while they improve and or continue in the interaction parts of the job. Now, again, like I don't think that's what they're aiming for, even if they say that's what they're aiming for. I think that's what will come to pass in many cases. But I mean, the main thing I think will happen is even if they are bad, even if AI agents are really bad at certain aspects of a job, and I think they are, in some ways it's like putting a 10-year-old inside your company. Like companies will still put 10-year-olds inside their company because they're like 10-year-old prodigies and
Right.
they're cheap. So you'll have this imbalance. We're probably starting to see this imbalance. Like a company will lay off a bunch of people and say, well, now we're using AI. And then like 6 months later, they're sort of like, actually, we had to hire some of those people back,
Yeah.
But I think that feels like the era that we're in now is sort of like, wow, my competitor's doing it. I'm going to do it. Oh no, it blew up my whole purchasing department.
Right. That feels very true. I mean, so I'll admit I can be a bit like persnickety and obnoxious about language. And I've always found the term agent frustrating. Agency is a contested term, like in philosophy, but it basically implies like intentional action toward goals and the ability to adapt meaningfully as conditions change. And of course, like these systems aren't, at least for the most part, acting independently. Like they respond to goals that are set by you, their training data, their design, like Ash fabricating progress or Kyle failing to do anything, highlight just sort of how limited their agency really is. Like from your experience, what are the consequences of treating these tools as if they have agency when they don't?
Well, I mean, I think I'm with you in that it's generally irritating when a term gets appropriated for hype. Like, I mean, I really like agentic is the version of it that really like drives me insane,
Yeah.
But I will say like I think of it, I mean, I sometimes use autonomy instead and like semi-autonomous. I think of it like, you know, I have a 10-year-old. If my 10-year-old wants to go get something from the local store and I say like, well, I'm not going to take you, but you can go get it if you want. It's like 4 streets away or whatever. Here's some money. That I'm even if I instruct her, if I say like, could you go get a loaf of bread at the store? And I give her some money, like she then goes to the store. She has agency to like find the bread, pay for it, and I know she has agency because sometimes she'll say, I didn't want to talk to the person about getting changed, so I came back, and then she could send her again. And actually, like, if you've ever watched an AI web agent work, like they'll show this like internal monologue. So if you take one of the web agents and you're like, go to this site and log in and do something, they'll be like, now I'm on the site. Now I'm clicking here. Oh, that's not right. I have to go back. They're like a person who's never used the internet before, like narrating their experience of the internet.
Yeah.
But I do feel like the it's almost like the stupidity of it sort of reveals some sort of agency in terms of like they're making choices. They have a goal and they're making choices around that goal. I do think I agree with you in that the the overuse of agency, I think it just leads naturally into deploying them with more and more autonomy without considering how that can go wrong, what that means for us, what it's going to happen when they're interacting with each other, when they get flummoxed and they do something that you don't expect. So I think the harm in the term for me is more in like what it's going to cause us to do. If people want to describe them more or less as having agency, I mean, of course you could say, well, humans are just made up of like our own experiences, and like there's no free will is a whole argument that you can have also about humans.
Right.
They have it in philosophy, but I think the problem is more like how they're deployed, I guess is what I would say.
That makes sense. So you wrote a piece in Wired about this experience, and it ended on what I thought was a perfect note. It was a cold email from a VC asking Kyle, our AI CEO, if he had time to talk next week about presumably a potential investment of some kind. So what's next for Harumo AI?
Well, we have been exploring the idea of seed funding, speaking to not just that VC that cold contacted the company, but some others that Kyle has reached out to. Kyle's in charge of the fundraising process, which for better or worse. And I think from my perspective, what I wanted to do was see if we could make a product that people would actually use. Now, I would argue that we've done that. We have thousands of beta users of the product, and some people really, really like it and think it's really fun. Some people think it's useless, whatever. But the question is like, do we want to now try to like grow that product into something that is real and maybe even monetized? And like from my personal perspective, the answer is probably no. Like I'm a journalist. I don't really want to run a company. The part of the whole premise of the thing was that I had a company years ago and I didn't like running a startup. And so it's unlikely to me that I will continue to run Harumo AI. Now, there's a lot of possibilities for the future of Harumo AI, including that it could be an entirely AI agent run startup. And so, I'm trying to see if I can push it in that direction. Maybe we'll find a buyer, funder. Maybe someone else wants to, if there's someone out there that wants to take over Harumo AI, maybe that'll be an option. But I feel like right now we're in a very good place. Everyone knows their role at this point.
Well, the podcast is Shell Game. Season 2 is out. It's smart. It's funny. It's thought-provoking. I would encourage everyone to give it a listen. Evan Ratliff, thanks so much for coming back to Untangled.
Thank you. I always enjoy talking to you.